Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for our first Noontime talk in conjunction with Designing Motherhood. We are so delighted and honored to be here with Katie Sobering and Galen Boone to discuss our first kind of in-depth thematic focus talk on queer parenthood. I will be giving a brief introductions of each of our speakers, and then they will do a short presentation introducing you to their work. And then we will come back together and segue into a discussion about how their practices are intersecting and talk more generally about queer theory and queer parenthood topics. So Katie Sobering, thank you for being here from Denton, Texas. Katie is an associate professor of sociology and a faculty affiliate in women's and gender studies at the University of North Texas. Her research examines how inequality is produced and disrupted in everyday life. She primarily uses ethnographic methods to understand gender, work, and politics in the US and Latin America. She's also a Fulbright scholar, and her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation. She earned a PhD in sociology from UT Austin in 2018, where she was also a graduate fellow in the Urban Ethnography Lab. And Galen Boone, who is tuning in from Joshua Tree, California, is a 2019 Wingate Lamar Fellow, metal worker, whose research explores camp fantasies, countering the myth of binary gender, and offers their own panoply of symbiotic gods, adorning androgynies in strange jewels, anatomical armor, metal pubic hair, and enameled nipples spilling drops of bone milk, posing them in alternative jungles of Eden. I will let them each dive into their own work, and we will start with Katie, who will be introducing the Queer Birth Project, of which one thread of it is behind us.
Got it. Sarah, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invite. I'm so thrilled to be here. I am speaking on about the Queer Birth Project today, but it's not exclusively my project. It's actually a collaborative project that I've been working on for the past couple of years with my colleague and dear friend, Liz LaFleur. You can see we had family photos taken recently. We were laughing about that, but Liz couldn't be here today because she just gave birth. So she has the best excuse in the world to stay where she is. And so if she's tuning in, we can all, hey, Liz. Liz is also a professor at UNT. That's where we met. We were both in the process of starting our families when we also kind of started to birth this project that had to do with queer childbirth and family formation. You might wonder, like, this is coming out of the University of North Texas, what, right? We've actually, to date, received institutional support from our institution to do this. So it's been a very interesting project to kind of push in this, this environment that we live in right now. And we've had graduate students as a part of it. So it's been a really interesting endeavor so far. So let me share with you a little bit about the project. So like I said, I'm a sociologist, and Liz is a studio artist. And so I approach my interest in queer parenthood very much from an academic perspective, a personal perspective as a queer parent, but also an academic perspective. In sociology, much of the research is just incredibly focused on cisgender experiences and heteronormative family structures. I don't think I need to have too many citations for you to believe me, right? But we don't have very much research on LGBTQ plus experiences of family formation, sort of from conception to through parenting experiences, right? A very kind of vast range of experiences has a very small literature. But what we do know is that LGBTQ experiences are really challenging our conventional theories, and I think incredibly worthy of further empirical exploration. So while I brought this sort of academic sensibility to these conversations that Liz and I were having, Liz was also bringing her own set of inspirations to this project, which were artistic and cultural, specifically rooted in her kind of fascination by Judy Chicago's birth project. Judy Chicago is a renowned feminist artist in the United States. And one of her like lesser known projects have to do with childbirth, right? And this is one of many needleworks that she produced as part of this sort of multi-year project where she asked how women feel about all aspects of birth. And she developed this very innovative collaborative methodology where she conducted a survey. She collaborated with a bunch of different textile artists and then produced this incredible work, which includes garments, it includes prints, and it includes textiles. And then at the end, she created the placement project, the birth project placement project, which then put these works into the public sphere. So they were in Planned Parenthood, they were in universities, they were in places that you might not expect to see, a textile that took hundreds and hundreds of hours to produce. And that was part of the project, and it was part of the conversation, getting these works out into the public, making them really accessible for people. So this was very much a source of inspiration for Liz as we started to talk about what an interdisciplinary project about childbirth could look like. But of course, we had our own spin on the question, right? Instead of asking about how women and cisgender people experience birth, we were interested in how queer people experience all aspects of birth. And we also dove into her research methodology and took a lot of inspiration from it, but also wanted to build on and kind of expand this idea of creating a contemporary feminist collaborative model that's based in really ethical research practices and also rooted in this idea of like broadly disseminating work to a public, to like many publics, not one public. We also in the process are charting this sort of intersection of art working with sociology. And we conceptualize this as methods braiding. This idea that we both have our individual practices, but that we weave them together in a way that really leverages the potentials and possibilities of interdisciplinarity, which is something that like lots of people talk about being great, but it's like, how does it actually work in practice when we have these models and trainings and kind of professional disciplines that discipline us into our way of practice. So the way that we've been doing this is largely through a lived experience of collecting real original stories from queer parents as data, in the form of data, and then letting that data inform artistic production. And then importantly, having the artistic production inform the data analysis, right? So more than just like saying we're both looking at the same data source and doing different things with it, we're continuing this weaving of our practices to try to do something that connects the dots in ways that continue to be creative into the analytic and process and then beyond. So we have right now a couple different sources of data. We ran a national survey. We have about 100 responses here that builds on a survey that Judy Chicago actually created, but then never actually made public as part of the birth project. I also have done about 30 in-depth interviews with queer parents, and I'm about to start another round. So this is a little PSA if you'd like to be involved. I'll share our contact information at the end, but this is really a deep dive, right, into people's lived experiences. And all along the way, Liz has been really focusing on our archival research, situating the project, not just in Judy Chicago's work, but also in these incredible archives that we have about queer culture in the US. The way that we have been sharing stories through art is through a variety of mediums that Liz is kind of has returned to throughout her career. The audio, creating immersive audio soundscapes, working with fringe, and experimenting with neon and also glass works. So I just wanted to talk about the 3 pieces just briefly that are in this show, and then I'm super excited to pass it over to Galen. I hope I'm not talking too long. Okay. So the first kind of set of works that make up the Queer Birth Project are a series of 6 libretti, which basically take the interview transcripts and survey data that we have, and we've thematically analyzed them and then woven them into song. These these lyrics are then performed. In one of the libretto, Liz sings them, and in another one we collaborated with a soprano who also lives in Denton, Texas. And the idea is to sing the stories of queer experience, and then Liz has digitally modified those to experiment with sort of a trans feminine queer voice using a series of different technologies. She's really interested in how the digital can intersect with the kind of lived experience. This is one of the pieces that you can see in the Designing Motherhood show. It's a little chromed listening device with these like playful beads that in one of the installations of the Queer Birth Project exhibition, users were invited to visitors were invited to walk around listening to different channels of audio, right? We've also published the actual text so that you can read what that's like. It's a little hard sometimes to pick it up when how it's been modified. I don't know, it's nice to read it and listen to it. And when the first exhibition we had, it was really like projected in the whole space, and it really created this like sound bath that you couldn't get away from. In some ways it was kind of disturbing, and in other ways it was, and I don't know, it felt kind of comforting as you walked through the rest of the exhibit. But it's really kind of experimenting with immersing in these stories. And this is very much tied to the direct data. So you just saw an excerpt from one of the libretto, and here is an excerpt from an interview I did with a respondent named Bailey, who actually lived in Georgia on a small farm, was raising a young one, and living there with their partner. And you can see the transcript here, which then was woven into the libretti word for word, right? And that's been really important to us about like, how do we create representations that really ethically engage with people's own storytelling? The second medium is this fringe that you can see behind me. You're looking at the second of the fringe pieces called the kinship gradient, orange to pink, which is listed a series of excuse me, color studies of Judy Chicago's work. And so each exhibition unit is inspired by one of those colors. You can see pink was a defining color for the exhibit on families. And it's also kind of experimenting with this idea of like walking through things, experiencing things, and also deconstructing this idea of deconstructing textiles, right? Which I mean, we can talk about how that like connects to queer theory, but obviously deconstruction is a key component there. And then the final medium is Liz's work with neon and glass. You see here a piece that we call Growing Bodies, Babies, which is, it's based on a series of line drawings that Liz did with her partner when they were pregnant. And every couple months, they did like another outline up until, I think that one was just days before she gave birth. And yeah, this was first installed, as you can see in this photo, on a window, and it overlapped with Pride Month in Dallas. So it was visible from both like inside the gallery, but also outside, which we thought was so cool, but also a little bit different. You can see, we can talk about the kind of inner workings of the neon, but we've been collaborating with a queer neon studio in New York. They're called Light Bright Neon, and they've been really like incredible to kind of push the medium and think about how neon can be kind of taken from its professional practice, because we see neon all the time, right, in terms of like signage and transformed into art pieces, right? So in other works we have neon that rotates, right, and neon that hangs and is doing things that kind of normal neon wouldn't. So like I said at the beginning, we'd love to hear from you. This is an ongoing project. So please do follow us. And if you're interested in sharing your stories, I would love to talk to you. So.
Thank you so much, Katie. So we will be diving back into the Queer Birth Project, but I'm going to turn it over to Galen Boone.
Hi, I'm so happy to.
I'll progress your slides, Galen, so.
Thank you. And I want to say coming to see this show in person was really moving, especially since it was the week after the election. And it's this tender and perilous moment and learning about the Queer Birth Project through this experience has been amazing. I'm not a parent yet, but I would really love to be, and looking at the resources online was exciting and very necessary for a lot of people. All right, so I'm excited to talk about my work. I think the overarching thing is talking about congenital queerness in the body and re-deifying binary collapse. And so there's just a lot of narratives like transness isn't natural and gender variance isn't natural or homosexuality isn't natural. But I was very briefly an archaeologist and I still do research throughout my life. And in every culture we have a record of, into our deep human past, there's record of all of these things. Like in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the highest castes of priestesses to Inanna or Ishtar were called Kurgara, and we'd call them trans femmes today. And so when I was in art school, I got really excited. So each of these characters is a moment of binary collapse. So here we have the mother um, in the loincloth and a bone necklace, and then the warrior in the breastplate and the collar of tongues, and a little metal pubic hair right there. And then these are the sirens. So taking odalisques, these recumbent female nudes from throughout Western art history and subverting them to these AMAB babes and calling in like the jungle of Eden. So it's not a garden in which Eros is exiled and like carnal knowledge is exiled. It's actually a celebration. And so we have some velvet loincloths and true beetles, Chrysochroa beetles, but it's like this is the uncanny moment of attraction and repulsion, like the beautiful, I don't know if there's a slide of this, but these are prismatic, colorful, real beetles, and then cast bronze cockroaches. And there's something about we denigrate culture like flies, cockroaches, insects as being repulsive, but they're a natural part of like planetary cycles and ecosystems. And so it's like, where does taboo come in, and what function does repulsion carry, especially when there's so much same-sex erotic desire latent in so many people and in every culture? So yes, so those are the beetles with their little brass legs. And then if you go back to the bone collars, this is for the mother. So combining life and death. So every birth, you know, is also you're birthing an eventual death, which is really tender and meaningful. But we bastardize birth in a lot of different ways. Like mothers have to be saintly and sexless, and childbirth is like pink and blue and like balloons is like a really hard liminal, like life-shattering experience, and you get to rebuild yourself after. So these are cow ribs and femurs that I broke down on the bandsaw into yonic shapes, and then all these little holes are where nerves go through, and it's just like sensation, and also vulvas. Collar of tongues, and then yeah. So inspired by Greco-Roman, in part by Greco-Roman armor. This is on display at the Met, and so I took this as a genderqueer person who slides, in between expression extremes. And so I made my own breastplate to wear. Oh, so this is a princess priestess from Ur. So this is one of the first like funerary suites of jewelry that's pretty much intact in the archaeological record. And so much of the work that I do is bringing in different kinds of divinities. I have a lot of hesitation to resistance with our the vindictive masculine sky god of Western culture. And so I'm really interested in different goddesses, different gods, different ways of worship. And in the ancient world, so much of this was through jewelry. And believing that jewelry is a conduit to otherworldly power and an homage to it. So just an aside, in the beautiful, like mirroring like cosmos, Earth, all metal was shot into planet Earth from the hearts of exploding dying stars. And like that is divine to me. I love a ziggurat. And then an exploding star. Yes. And devotion. So the heart, so why I love Judy Chicago is she was doing similar work, bringing in mythologies, divinities, and like heroic women that we don't get a lot of exposure to. And I think that Judy Chicago is still kind of dismissed as a feminist artist or only seen through that lens, and how rude. Okay, so this is the mother. So a genderqueer babe wearing bone, enameled nipples, spilling bone milk, and then has a menstrual pour of uh, coral, jasper, and silk. And it's this erotic experience of bodily expression, excretion, and re-eroticizing the mother archetype that a lot of people try to keep in this weird Madonna horror split. Yes. Death, blood, bones. The siren, seduction, repulsion. Yes. Love a cockroach too. This is me in art school. And the pectoral is a masculinizing of my chest with those little enameled nipples. And it's this I raised female in California, in the United States in the 90s. There was accessing my own desire was not a part of the way I was raised. And in this warrior, it's collapsing like the, carnality is, how do I want to say this? We can have strong desire and a fierceness without there being violence. So this is like a fae warrior with no weapons, but still strong, and like armor that obscures the nude body that has been objectified, like the female, if we want to call me a female, nude body in art history. And so like covering those tender places, strengthening them with armor, that's metal pubic hair. And then all this is like copper. And the collar of liars' tongues, like there's a retaking of narrative. And then actually in some tellings of the Garden of Eden, the apple is not an apple, it's a pomegranate. And of course, that is also a reference to AFAB sex organs. Yeah, this is the panoply of armor.
Okay. Are you ready to, Galen? Are we ready to segue or,
Yes.
sorry, there's a lag.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much, Galen, for introducing us to your work. And you can see Galen's work on view in the space, and the rest of the Queer Birth Project threads also on view in the other galleries. So I am excited now to kind of bridge your practices and chat a little bit about some of the kind of more macro queer theory topics about that intersect with parenthood and caregiving. So Judy Chicago is most well known for the dinner party, which made literal seats at a table for women, historical, mythological, and many of them misunderstood or vilified, and kind of the crux of this work is about destabilizing this patriarchal paradigm and telling, and it's really about storytelling. And I think, of course, there's a clear referential connection between Judy Chicago's work and the Queer Birth Project, but I also wanted to use this as a way to link the kind of destabilizing of gendered archetypes through history that Galen engages with in their work. So here we have two of those seats. We have the Amazon and Ishtar, who Galen actually already spoke about a little bit. And I'm wondering if each of you could kind of talk about, this this approach to history. Each of you are coming from actually disciplines adjacent to art. And so sociology, Galen started in archaeology. And kind of, could you talk about how each of those lenses and disciplines kind of have factored into your practice?
Well, I'm so happy to talk about Ishtar all day long, but what has been revelatory about anthropology and archaeology is it's almost like the culture you're raised in, if you're not exposed to anything else, what is actually wallpaper. It's like what I thought was true and normal for life, like it was just wallpaper. I had to tear it down to see a wider view of like what human expression can be. And we need to reach back into histories and other experiences to make sense of where we're headed now. And I love Ishtar and Nana. She became Isis in Egypt. She became Freya in Norse mythology. She's Venus today, but Venus in Greco-Roman myth and in our modern conception is just the goddess of like love, harmony, beauty, and art. But in the ancient world and earlier, like before civilization, the mother archetype, the goddess archetype had death and war in her too. And so Ishtar was the great god of Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Babylon. So instead of having a vindictive masculine sky god who doesn't like sex or women's bodies, the main god who was worshipped in that part of the world was Inanna or Ishtar, and she was queen of heaven and earth, and she was born every morning a virgin and went to sleep every night a whore. And because no man was above her, she took her son as consort. And so she is the goddess of sacred sex, what we call prostitution. And I'm interested in a motherhood that encompasses eros, taboo, power, and ferocity. And it's affirming to see that in the archaeological record and in mythologies that have been pushed aside by, Abrahamic patriarchy. Also, I want to say that in the origin, in the Garden of Eden and the Genesis story, the stealing of birth from women and the stealing of pleasure. So that in the Garden of Eden, Adam gives birth to Eve after Lilith wouldn't lie beneath him, and out of his rib. And like, what? Like that's feels like a cop out to remove women from the story. And then the Annunciation, where Mary, who's a 13-year-old, becomes pregnant by the light of God and remains a virgin. Well, first of all, her virginity only became doctrine 500 years after Jesus died, in a speech made by a pope who is known for pretty rabid sexism. So that is not even a part of like original Christianity. Is the Madonna horse split was engineered much later. Okay, that's my
Thank you, Galen. Yeah.
I love hearing you talk about Ishtar because it's like farther back in history than I can speak to. But I'm so glad you kind of situated this in the context of Judy Chicago's Birth Project, because so has anyone here seen it? I mean, so right now, and it's permanently installed at the Brooklyn Museum, and you walk into this room and it's just this kind of overwhelming. I mean, it's like in scale, it's really large, right? And each place setting is for sort of like a woman who's a historical figure that has been left out, over the centuries. And so it's a really impactful piece to see. It's in this it's permanently installed. Anyone who goes through museums in New York has the opportunity to see it, right? So it seems like, oh, it's always been like this, right? But actually, when Judy Chicago created the dinner party, it was very controversial, right? Museums wouldn't exhibit it. They tried to do a traveling show. They had to cancel it. Pieces that were, I mean, it got really kind of like the vitriol that surfaced around this piece it was 74 to 79, right? It was a really intense kind of public reaction to this piece. And so it wasn't showed, right? And the kind of second part of that is that it's big, right? You can't just like set it on a table as part of another exhibition, right? It demands to take up institutional space, which was another kind of affront, right? So when I've been doing research with Liz about the Birth Project, right? And the Birth Project was the subsequent project for Judy Chicago after Dinner Party. And because of the reaction to Dinner Party, because they couldn't get it exhibited, Judy Chicago actually made a connection with a woman here in Houston, right? And one of the first exhibitions of the Dinner Party was here at Clearwater, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And it was one of the places where it was made public. If I don't want to say it's for the first time, I don't want to speak outside of what I know, but it was one of the kind of first big exhibitions of that work. And it was through those conversations. So with people from Houston just like flocked to this exhibition, right? It was a big deal to install it. Everything's very fragile. And it created like lots of talk in the art world, talk among feminist communities, and it connected people that then laid the groundwork for the Birth Project, which is really interesting, right? So there were networks that were built to create institutional spaces for Chicago's work that then laid the groundwork for this next piece, right? Or set of pieces. So the Birth Project was really born out of the social ties that were developed because of the dinner party. And for a long time, the dinner party was literally like housed in a warehouse and they didn't have a place to put it. And it was, I think, a defining moment for Judy Chicago in her career, feeling that exclusion as like a woman in art in the 1970s. So this was, I mean, certainly not the first time that she felt that, but this was a huge kind of moment for her. And so when with the dinner party, this transition to the Birth Project, then the idea was, if the dinner party is huge and fragile and like very hard to get out into the public, how can we make pieces that we can distribute widely, right? And so much of Dinner Party informs Birth Project. These are just two different images of works from the Birth Project.
Yeah, needleworked.
Yeah.
Tapestries.
And so what they're doing is Judy Chicago is really interested in what she calls like a universal experience of like woman mother, right? So you'll see in a lot of these pieces a recumbent figure, no face, right? There's a couple that are supported by other figures. So in the bottom one, you can see that there's actually a birth partner like supporting the birthing mother in this example, and then the child coming out. And but the singularity of the birthing figure she really understood that as like speaking to this like universal experience of birth, right? Which there's also a book that she wrote about the makings of the birth project, right? And she worked with all these textile workers they were all mothers, right? In 1981, most of them were mothers. She collected surveys of them. She actually observed births. And she's still creating single images of something that is, even in the data she has has all these multiplicities, has all these different experiences, right? And so that was one of the things that we've talked through around queering the birth project, thinking about what diversity of those experiences, how we represent that, right? Instead of putting in a singular image, creating like multiples, and you can actually see it behind, right? These sort of multiple bodies that not only show progression over time, right, but also kind of imply more than one experience of something that I think for a very long time, and I mean, back to, into mythology, has been sort of reified as something that's like a universal experience of all women, right? But is something that in practice is so very different and has such different meanings among people. So.
Yeah, I was, thinking about this moment in time right around the birth project, kind of the interstitial period between dinner party and birth project. Judy Chicago is founding the first feminist art program in Fresno and in California. And this is before there were women's study, gender study, queer theory in academia. And I think there's something really interesting about, the move from this piece to this piece, and thinking about queering and queer theory as like a questioning or a subverting of something that we perceive as static or as paradigm. And it's a move for me as art historian here from female archetypes through history to origin story and like genesis, and like queering that story actually, and recentering it from a feminist perspective. So I'm interested too in you're talking about the kind of community connections and the sociological really ties that made not only this project possible, but in birth work and in craft, really community is, and communal connections, intergenerational knowledge, kind of skill sharing is so inherent to both of those disciplines. From needlework and passing those kinds of like hand skills between families, between generations, and then also the kind of analog with birth working. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the stretch of the project, how you've done 2 pieces and there are 5.
6.
Oh, there's 6.
Yeah.
There's 6.
You're good.
So could you talk about kind of the future of this project?
So the way that and this is like largely informed by the data, but the way that we have been conceptualizing how to create art out of the data has been around thematic collections. So we did the first exhibition unit, which had the bellies in it on bodies, and queer experiences of the body in the process of family formation. The second exhibit was about families and family structures, thinking about the family as thinking about queer families in the context of the family being the most violent institution in our society, and how there's all this reconfiguration happening, reproduction and reconfiguration of family formations. And we're also working on collections on loss, childbirth, care work, with a focus on feeding and identities. And they're all sort of in the plural there, but it felt like each one was big enough to give it its own space, to think through analytically and to represent culturally.
Could you talk about the importance of the materials that you're choosing? I know you briefly introduced the idea of kind of like denaturing or like destabilizing the textile into just the fringe, or like the warp almost, just and not having those kinds of the cross that makes it this almost architectonic structure.
Right. The fringe is something that I wish Liz was here, because she can speak so much better than I can about it. But this is a medium that she's been experimenting with for, I think, throughout her career. Coming out of the closet or walking through the fringe has all these metaphors around identity in today, and thinking about fringe as a deconstruction of traditional craft is part of that. It's also deeply experiential, right? I think about Judy Chicago's textiles as being deeply experiential for the people who created them, like these hundreds of needle workers, lots of whom still live in Houston, by the way, you can probably find them, that literally poured hours of their lives into this like highly embodied piece, right? But with fringe, all of us can experience it, right? We can walk through it, we can, feel it and touch it, and like I just want to hold it the whole time, right? Because it's it just invites a different perspective. The first
Thematic.
Right.
Yeah.
The first fringe for the birth project that Liz designed was actually in the structure of a baby mobile. It followed one of Calder's kind of classic designs, and the idea was, and it was really large, like much taller than this fringe. So when you walked through it and it had all these intersecting angles, it was designed to make you feel childlike, right? Like almost like a baby laying laying on their backs, like looking up at something that was, like moving and shifting, and changing their perspectives on things. So yeah.
I am really interested in fringe, and I think that there's a lot of contemporary artists who are using fringe as a queer material or a queering material. And we're cited in a gallery that is called Temporary Bodies. It's like one of the final chapters of the Designing Motherhood book, and it's coined by a fashion historian, Lauren Downing, and it's about the fact that our bodies are all in a constant state of change. They are always evolving, changing. It's not only through, the experience of carrying a child, but even just carrying burritos in your stomach, or, shifting and aging and needing different kinds of designs, garments in the case of, what she was thinking about to accommodate our lived experience. And almost everything in here, from a design perspective, is significant for the way that it can expand or contract, and accommodate the ever shifting nature of the body. And I think that that's also really central to queer theory. It's actually never static. And if, you're denaturing, destabilizing a norm, then you have to re-question that, whatever then enters that. And I think for me, what's important about fringe, and this work in particular, is that it's kinetic, too, like it's moving, and I think about it as, adornment too, and costuming, and like camp, and but also Western wear and like cowboy outfits. So yeah, it just feels it's a very like loaded material signifier for me.
I'd love to, can I tie this to Galen's work? I'd love to hear like how you in your process have thought about like this issue of static images in relation to queering subjects, or static representations around this idea of queering.
Static, like physically from a photograph,
Or
or
like unchanging, or how, or like the way that you've sort of approached, like creating a singular representation of something in a process of deconstruction? Or for, you said collapsing binaries,
And like static archetypes. I wonder if you two could talk a little bit about what you're working on right now, which is another archetype.
yes, well, so the static archetypes, I think that the only that they're always mutable, but we receive them like they're static. And like I moved to see these needle points from GD Chicago et al. Because it's a different archetype of motherhood than in like late 20th century America. It's like I'm seeing rivers, mountains, and the connection of the child to the hands of this person who's holding. Let's see. I think that like queer archetypes are just like changing so rapidly. I'm a child of the 90s, and I remember The Real World was the first show to show queer people. And I'm really moved to think about how just seeing representations of queer families coming out of the birth project, like even look at the website, I like choked up a little bit because there's like beautiful images. Um, that is going to be radically shifting the possibilities. That's why representation and visibility are so important, because they allow you to imagine your life in different ways. I didn't get that. I didn't realize for a while what was going on. And the archetypes of, so maybe kind of a clumsy tie-in to the work I'm gestating now, is I'm really interested in, like, we have all these archetypes, cultural archetypes, like aggression is masculine, like strength is masculine, softness, receptivity is feminine. And I am doing research in the early medieval period of martyrs and mystics and warrior women who I'm sure a lot of them today, if they were born today, would be queer and probably trans spectrum, like Joan of Arc. When she was killed, there's transcript from the trials, and the sword she died on, or like the flame she died in, was her refusal to stop wearing men's clothing. That is, she said, it's my divine right given to me by God, and direct mystical experience, which was incredibly threatening to a masculine patriarchal church structure that said that nature had to be controlled, women could not have power, and only the church could speak to what is divine. I'm looking at Jude Chicago's needle points. That's divinity right there. All this electric intersecting energy. But so Joan of Arc was 13 when she received visions, and 17 when she led uh, the exiled French Dauphin's soldiers throughout France. That is wild, that I don't think we really appreciate. And there's all these like paintings of Joan of Arc looking like a blonde little angel. She was short, stocky, and had short, dark hair, and was not known to be a beauty. And I'm so much more interested in those kinds of things. And also all the martyrs and mystics, the women who were killed, like unlike Teresa de Avila, who her her direct mystical experience was kind of assimilated by the church pretty easily. It's like these women who are arguing for the eros of nature, and like Hildegard von Bingen, who was excommunicated because of her writings, like the ecstasies of nature. And like you can't keep it down. It's like weeds coming through the sidewalk, you know? I don't know if that
I
answered any of these questions, but that's where I went.
Well, I think this is a nice moment maybe to think about, both of your kind of interdisciplinary approaches to art making, and how that influences things like kinship and genealogy and our ideas of family. And I'm wondering, we have some posters here that are part of the Queer Birth Project and that relate to these mobiles again, as these kinds of like, I don't know, a queering of the genealogy tree, or genealogy modeling. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, and then maybe Galen, if you could also talk about kind of kinship formation, chosen family, the idea of family and kind of queer community.
Yeah, thank you. So one piece that I didn't talk about that you can see on the right of the slide is a series of what we call family constellations that that we created for each of the people that I interviewed. So after each interview that I did, I would sit down and, I mean, I'm not an artist, right? Like when I draw something, it's, very rudimentary, but I basically mapped out the families that I interviewed. And some of the interviews, one person would show up, some of them, like 3 people would show up and someone would be nursing. And like, I'm glad that I didn't like put any boundaries around that, because some folks wanted to talk about their family building experiences alone and others in community. So it created a really fun interview process, a little bit hard at times, but what I did afterwards was mapped out who I had talked to and who they'd mentioned. Right. And so some of these kind of family maps looked like the sort of 2 parents and 2 kids and a dog type thing, so it was just 2 primary parents and a couple of children. And there was sort of no mention of other folks. But that was definitely the least common configuration that I depicted, right? Lots of them had kind of extending spiderweb networks of kin, chosen kin, biological kin, donor support, surrogates, multiple children lost, right? Babies that were stillborn, right? Or fetuses that were aborted, that continued to be a part of family narratives, right? So increasingly, these little maps got kind of hard to draw. And so as Liz saw them one day and was like, I'm taking those. And we started to have these conversations around how we would map queer family structures. So we went to the literature on how you create genograms, which has a long history, right? And it's a long history that's very much tied into patriarchal power maintenance, right? This like hierarchical, patriarchal kind of controlled format that over the years has been adapted, right? There's actually different models now of creating genograms that are based on relational structures. Like the lines are not bio lines, the lines are relations, right? And so there's some like squiggly lines and hatched lines. And I didn't realize this, but I guess family therapists will draw out the systems that they're working with. But very few of these models are queering the structure, right? And making space for these sort of explosions of people who are really meaningful to family formation, right? And so Liz and I have talked a lot about what it means to kind of like really release the boundaries of that and let people let it come from people's own words what family means, right? Which has prompted this reevaluation of kinship, which we call constellations, just trying to like make, grapple with the fact that they change, right? So time isn't static with this. Like some people are dead. Some people are not there anymore. There's like absences that are hard for folks to make sense of, sort of social exclusions that play into these things. So there's just like a lot of movement around the forms. And so Liz created mobiles. And we had 12 of them, I think, in the exhibit on families. And they're all made out of cut glass and then linked together. And then Liz put little charms to refract the light through them. So they were kind of a stunning little collection of family constellations that we're trying to visually represent what it would mean to deconstruct a genogram.
Yeah. I think, you know, within the Designing Motherhood universe, which is it's this really multivalent project. It's a book, it's an Instagram archive, it's a syllabus, a design syllabus, and there's a very expansive consideration of design in this scholarship, and policy, legislative policy is design, and it's really trying to unveil the kind of power and agency in the designs around our reproductive lives. And for me, the design history of something like a kinship chart or genogram, and the way that you have been able to change it into something that is flexible. I know Liz said that there's like ends that she didn't finish the ends, so that it can be like changing or grow. It can connect to another chart. I'm really interested in the way that
She did. She left all these like little ends,
like threads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's something really powerful about that gesture. Galen, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your experience and the way that you're considering. I know that we've had lots of amazing conversations about community and built families.
Yes. The last place I lived was in the Bay Area of California, which is like a queer hub that even like I grew up in a liberal family on a liberal coast, and being gay and being in the Bay is amazing because you walk down the street, you just see like two moms together. You like everywhere you go, there's just like queer culture, and it's like its own world, its own language, and its own. You have these different almost they're familial ties in structures that are fluid and um, really affirming. And I remember a few years ago, I typed lesbian into a library, an art library, and found these images from Versailles from 1932. So he's a Hungarian French photographer. These are black and white images of, we'll call them women because the trans discussion hadn't come out yet. But I wish I had slides for these because I remember like holding this book and just like, I think going like hot and cold, like just feeling so connected in a lineage sense to these people. So there's like a dapper bartender with like short hair and a tie, and these butch and femme couples. One of my favorite images is in the holdings of the Met Museum in New York, and it's called Fat Claude and Her Girlfriend, and it's this view from above of this like gay couple at a bistro table, and just like it felt so modern, but also like they're black and white. The styles are really like 1930s. It's almost like this like deep longing to reach through and be a part of that world. And there was this blossoming in the interwar period in Europe. So before the turn of the 20th century, there's a lot happening in the early 20th century, and there's this pull from rural countrysides into cities, but that's where like the gay exodus happened into forming communities in cities. And so it was like Berlin, it was London, it was Paris, and it was New York. We have a lot of images, histories, oral history, like culture from this period. And this is like where I see like the modern queer connections, because you have, for the first time in at least modern Western history, you have a lot of queer people in the same space and then signaling to each other. So I did a deep dive into researching signifiers. So these images from Versailles are taken at a bar called the Monocle. And so in Paris, gay women would surreptitiously signal their sapphic affiliation by wearing a monocle. And there's this whole period at the same time. Um, the Boyette look took over these hubs, London, Paris, France, from the very wealthy women who started diet culture for the first time. They wanted to have boy bodies. I think there's like a lot of trans narratives or like gender queering, but they wanted to look boyish in their suits. And so I don't know if I can say that word, gay women would wear monocles. In London, it was a pinky ring. And I don't know if there was a specific one in New York, but I'm really interested in the sort of a lot of queer family structures and community structures have to do with how to connect and build families under oppression, under potential like threats of potential violence, outside of legal family structures. And so there's a lot of creativity and there's a lot of grief, I think, in a lot of these constellations of connection, love, supporting each other, and building countercultural kind of Edenic experiences with like different jargon and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think there's, we're gonna tie it up soon and then open it up for conversations with y'all because I really want to hear from you. And folks who are on Facebook, I'll try to figure out how to see your questions as well. So there's a takeaway in the exhibition that says you don't have to do it that way, or that way, or their way, or her way, or your, and you can do it your way. That's not exactly what it says, but close enough. And I think the kind of like liberatory, like restoring agency, power, and confidence into this like high pressure cooker, parenthood, motherhood, all of these things are marketed to us in such a deeply socially stratified way. And having just the permission, I think both of your works have that kind of liberate, this like crux of liberation baked into them. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think Galen, you said it so well when you said that, creating all these different representations invites people to imagine different futures, right? And that's really at the heart of not just, I mean, I think that as a social scientist, it's so important to collect these stories, right? When you were talking about queer culture in these different cities, it made me think about some of the methodological problems we have even now of like, what does it mean to collect these stories? How do we keep these stories safe? How do we share them in an ethical way? And like, what's the politics of bringing these stories to light? When you're looking back into archives, for example, like, hunting for like evidence of queer culture is related to the fact that these things weren't documented for a reason, right? And the lack of documentation related, like what you said, Galen, is about safety. It's about communities being able to exist in a way that was outside the mainstream on purpose, right? So that's something that I think a lot about in relation to opening up space for this like radical imagination.
I would like to hop in for a second and speak to the loss of archive. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Magnus Hirschfeld and his sexological research, but he was eventually exiled by the Nazis and all of his research was burned. And it was the largest repository for erotic research and queer and homosexual research. And he was first struck, like he was a Jewish gay man, incredibly brilliant. And he was the first person to advocate for policy to protect gay people and the trans experience. And he was struck by this when he was doing research early in his career and he saw these anthropological accounts of homosexuality in places like Tokyo and all around the world. And it struck him that there's a universal like queerness is universal. And so he amassed all this research, and like before people like Havelock Ellis, you know, made homosexuality the other, there was a lot more slippage, like, you know, shadow wives is when two women would live together and it was like, are they or aren't they? But, or like romantic friendships within women were celebrated. Like, um, who's the sad poet who was single and then died young, and her quotes are on the tea bags? Like, bring me the sunset in a cup. Victorian. She was always writing love letters to her friends. Like, there's this, you know,
Virginia? No.
no, she was sadder than Virginia Woolf, and she was in invalid or had health issues. Next time I pull up in a tea bag, it's gonna be her quote. I'm gonna be like, damn.
Oh, Dickinson.
Thank you, Emily Dickinson. But so there's a way in that, like in the early 20th century, when science created a category for homosexuality, there was like a full whole like pulling apart of, okay, then that's, we don't do that. And yeah, the underground histories and the incredible loss. And it's like the erasure of these histories is an aspect of fascism.
So I wanted to end on kind of a more maybe kind of looser, you know, idea about queerness, pregnancy, and you know, especially cited in this particular gallery. This quote from Maggie Nelson, Argonauts, which is like a book that really changed my life. But is there something inherently queer about pregnancy itself, insofar as it profoundly alters one's normal state and occasions a radical intimacy with and radical alienation from one's body? How can an experience so profoundly strange and wild and transformative also symbolize or enact the ultimate conformity? So I want all of us to kind of maybe segue into Q&A, and just maybe response. Thank you so much for being here. We really, you know, this exhibition is so it's so expansive, and like you said, it's every person that's walking around was born, so it is a very universalizing topic. And it's like, how do you even make an exhibition about something so big, you know? So I think it's really important for me that we have these like deep dives into some of the thematic threads in the show. And this quote really struck me, you know, thinking about queerness as like maybe the reproductive experience in and of itself, you know, this like liminality, this like profound strangeness, potentially, or questioning, or building, you know. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
I don't know.
Galen. So Galen, I'm going to repeat it just because our HVAC is blowing and it might have been hard to hear. But audience question was that maybe a word is that bringing this exhibition to Houston is brave, and that they were surprised that the first showing of the dinner party was in one of the first showings was in Houston. And have you been to Houston, and like how do you feel about the show being cited? It's actually the first time the show has traveled to the southern United States. It's been in 5 other cities. And so it is a pretty, it was a major impetus for the curatorial team to bring it.
I was really moved. So I came to Houston a month or 2 ago for the show opening, and it was the same week as the election. And obviously, reproductive rights was a huge part of that. And so when a lot of the artists were here with a walkthrough with Sarah Darrow and also members of the public, and a lot of us teared up as we listened to artists talk about the work and like just living in the new normal. And it is really brave. And I think, if this were in New York, that would be a different experience, or LA or San Francisco. And there is something that is like it's the places where access to reproductive health and abortion that needs to be experienced. Like this is where this shows like this need to go, because it's almost like we're everyone we like with the liberal big hubs, we like know where. Let's see, I'm getting a little lost. It did feel brave. It felt also like a homecoming, like this, like birth and like it's universal, but there's a narrative change in certain places. And I know that Texas has been a place where reproductive rights have been challenged and access has been limited. And so a lot of us were in tears in the gallery, really moved to be there in this moment and having this show in Houston. I was also really enamored with Houston as an art hub and full of creativity, art, color, great food. So by no means like it's like obviously um, it's not rural Alabama, which I think like the heart of this also needs to travel to these places where it's like a grim feeling for a lot of women. And I remember one woman who's an artist, I forget her name right now, but she said, I am a mother twice over, and I've also had an abortion. And as a mother, it is so clear to me that we need to have access to things like abortion and this like choice of like bringing in life and death because of the huge commitment it is to be a parent and to be in that relationship and be able to be supportive to that child.
In some instances here, Galen talking about, censorship and how fairness has been censored over generations. Why do you think that is, especially when it comes to queer parenthood?
I'm going to repeat it for Galen and the audience here, but thinking about why do you think queerness and queer parenthood has been censored historically?
Oh, because it doesn't conform to power structure, like received power structure. Like in ancient Rome, like the consolidation of patriarchy, patriarchal power was passed down in big parties called symposia, which, which is like when elite men in Rome would have gay sex with younger men and through their semen transfer patriarchal power. And like women's roles were really constrained in ancient Rome. And it's interesting, like, and in like, in Greece as well, Athenian women were kept inside the home. And there's all this valorization of like erotic male bodies And so like the narrative is like men's bodies are the norm, you know, like we all we all begin as zygotes in utero, and we either have XX or XY chromosomes. XX is female, XY is male, which means that femaleness is fundamental to, or like femininity is fundamental to being a human, and like all human zygotes appear female until those zygotes with Y chromosomes go through a series of mutations that turn them into boy children or AMAB babies. And that's why there's higher instances of like infant mortality, congenital defect with boys, is because like there's like a deviation from a sort of norm. And that's outside of power structures. That's like not, that doesn't work for patriarchy. That's why Adam in the Garden of Eden had to give birth to Eve. And so you have to, like, if we like going back to what we were saying, is like you have to limit the imagination and the possibilities for power and agency to be able to be an oppressor. Like you have to limit what people believe is possible to keep people under your thumb. Excuse me, my laptop might die soon. I'm gonna quickly go off camera. I'm not ready to give you guys a tour of my home, and then I'm gonna plug in.
Any other audience questions or just thoughts?
Thank you for this talk. Love this talk and the solution. I know it's great, just thinking about where I'm going, singular and learning in the side. One of the things that's so striking is that they don't really hire me that way. Okay. I'm curious for both of you, what that dream place would be for the world. If you can manifest it as an indoor work or an institution, where that would be, where it would look like.
I love that question.
Such a good question.
Thank you.
So speaking for the Queer Birth Project, we're 2 exhibition units into 6, right? And Liz has this big dream of exhibiting all 6 together. And because because there's only 2 created, like to me, it's hard to envision that, but it's a big dream considering the scale of some of these pieces. And so that would be such a good question for her, because I imagine she's like scheming towards these like really big spaces to do that in, which obviously that's not the purpose of the project. We've been thinking about how the pieces can be mobile, right? So that they can join conversations with, you know, exhibits like Designing Motherhood and other spaces. But I think the big vision would be putting all 6 of those. Part of that big vision is putting them in conversation and feeling the intersections of the themes that, you know, we've talked about. What does it mean to really separate family from identity, or bodies from feeding, right? Like it's artificial, right? And so that's like the big dream.
But I also wonder, you know, is it antithetical to the work to place it within an institution altogether, right? If like the basis of it is about bucking structures that are oppressive.
We have, so like the takeaway, for example, it's to be printed in endless editions, right? And so we've been thinking about ways to make this like very accessible. It could also be taken as an art print and framed. It could be put on a wall. ITAs have them on their office doors, right? Like they're like ways to take, you know, neon, for example. One of the neon pieces that we have from the most recent exhibition is being produced as an artist edition, and all of the proceeds benefit. There's a nonprofit called Family Equality that does a lot of sort of advocacy around queer families in the US. And so some of the neon is being like additioned to support organizations that are supporting queer families, right? But neon itself is hard to share widely because it's so fragile, you know? So we've even talked about creating prints of the neon. Like what would that be to have a print that then could be placed in a doctor's office, for example, or heaven forbid, a fertility clinic. I don't know if any of you have been in one of those, but the Ann Geddes images could definitely go.
Yes.
And be replaced with something like this, which like speaks to themes that, you know, obviously resonate with some people that walk through those doors. So
Yeah, a decentralized presentation too is like, or like how you're saying where it can like constantly grow. That feels
Yeah.
very in keeping with the,
for sure.
yeah. Galen, I'm not sure if you heard the question, but when you were, did you hear it? What would be, could you say it again? You said it really well.
So like, just like, what would be the ideal place for your work?
Yeah.
Something.
If your work were able to anchor an institutional space the way the dinner party has, where it has like, it's, you know, a gallery built for it and it's a permanent home for it, what would be the space of your dreams, of your dreams?
I think it's hard for me to say because, and I feel a little self-conscious for expressing this. But making is a part of it feels like a coming through of even otherworldly energy and experience. And so, like, one of the things that has moved me to make the work that I do is like it's reverence and devotion with different aspects of divinity. And so I don't think it would be a museum because or like how we split away, we go into like we split like ecstatic mystical experience belongs in a church, synagogue, you know, mosque, and like art belongs in museums. And you know, at least in the, I mean, no, throughout the world, art making, image making, object making, adornments have come out of experience with loss, like cataclysm, worship, like, you know, these like, and so I think that I think why it's so important to like, you know, like some people think that art's not for them. And so like, why would I go to a museum? And it's like, I don't know where I'm hoping that like the more we move forward, that there's just gonna be all this sort of collapse in between like what spaces are for or like what art is for. But at the bare minimum, it would be a space that you could access for free. You know, like and also maybe a space that is also has an aspect of feeding in some way. Like there's there's an exchange, not just like common kind of uh like there's like secular worship in museums, right? Like you see a piece and you're like struck and you're like, oh, like whoa, like I feel that. And there's like a sort of uh ecstasy of experience. And I think that at a fundamental level, art is about like where art comes from, like cave paintings and little amulets, is about relationship. So whatever the space would be, the core of it would be relationship, not a sort of abstract worship of some sort of artistic skill.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for asking.
Yeah, such a good question.
Yeah. Okay.
I had a question. One, just to confirm, we did this correct.
And the monitor.
The monitor in the larger gallery, which I can take you into after we wrap up and show you that piece. Yeah.
And then second question, are you able to go into a little more detail about the different kind of like theater, like family, diagrams, I guess like, you know,
interviews, just to kind of get a better idea as to like weighing them at the process, I guess. Possible for imagination, I guess. If you for someone who like has grown up like very good past and a lot of aspects of what I'm familiar now, it is, just kind of serious about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that question. The idea of these constellations, you know, obviously they're changing, but part of the interviews that I did, a lot of it focused on, well, you know, how did you build your families, and like not just like what the logistics of that was, but there's a lot of logistics for some queer people to have children, to forge partnerships, to expand in partnerships, right, to include different people. And so there were conversations about logistics and lots of conversations about the meanings of those experiences, right? So I tried to keep them very broad, to open space for folks to share what they'd been through. And so in terms of the constellations, like I said, that some of them were kind of simple, right? That kind of just included caregivers and children, but others had, you know, took the opportunity to really talk about these expansive forms of kinship. So for example, there was one person that I interviewed who had one partner, and they identified as a woman, and they had a child with using an anonymous sperm donor, right? So they talked about the process, how that was like for them. And then at a certain point, what had happened was they got connected with a Facebook group of folks who also had used the same donor to have their children. And so they connected with other people who had, so basically half siblings with their siblings, like half bio siblings, if we're gonna like, that's one of the things we try not to do is reify biology in this. But they ended up connecting with them through Facebook, which was really interesting. And then they go on vacations in the summer, right? So in the constellation of that family, you have caregivers, you have parents, you have sort of extended kinship networks. And then in these teeny tiny hearts, there's like 13 dibblings, which is what they call them, donor siblings. And so the kind of balance of this constellation is really interesting, because there's all these kind of, you know, like really central ties, but then lots of like interesting connections that will change, right? Like obviously those relationships will change over time, and there's like lots of question marks about what that means, but this family had really kind of leaned into embracing that a connection with those people, which was really interesting. And all of it had been facilitated during COVID through social media. So it had kind of an interesting story in that way too. So that's just one example of many. Yeah.
I think back on that, I did want to speak to you as a queer parent, right? I did also speak to you, and just I appreciate the representation, honestly. I think a lot of us queer folk, regardless of their age, relate to having to find our own family, and having to, you know, figure out and navigate what home looks like. So I really appreciate the information. And even just the girls that you described, just kind of being able to add on to and create what you want your home and your family to look like. You know, I know a lot of us people who are queer experience that, like that's a big thing for us. You know, so I just really love it. And I also just want to say that I appreciate what both of you guys are saying again, as someone who's queer and as nothing. Just trying to like reconfigure what being a mother looks like, a parent is like, a queer person, you know. And initially, I know you said that this was this progression. But when I initially saw it, I thought, oh, this is a bunch of different because we all look differently, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's just see a physical manifestation of what a lot of us experience. And you know, like you said, it's not specific or necessarily specific to cisgender women, you know, like it's a clear experience. Even if you are a home parent, you know, you still don't know your parent. and just really understanding. I really love that, that it's here, and like Galen is going to, you have to reimagine the possibilities, and I think that's where a lot of people are stuck and kind of stuck behind, if I can be honest, and not being able to really expand their thinking and just understand that family doesn't is. And like Galen said, also, it's violent, I'm sorry, you said the structure of it in general is just a violent thing, so I just really love that. I appreciate your representation, so and even like being Boone, listening to you guys talk, I was like almost experienced, because I have been looking for, and so this is very good. Thank you.
Do you want to summarize that for Galen?
Yeah,
Did you hear?
Galen,
No,
did you hear any of
So good, but I heard like 3 words.
that? Okay. How can I summarize this well? Do you want to come like say it a little like a little bit closer to the laptop?
So I was just, thank you for speaking to us today, but I just wanted to, or I was just speaking to the idea that you had kind of talked about of recreating family and what that dynamic looks like. Just as someone who is queer, I don't experience, family closeness, like biological family closeness, but I appreciated you guys speaking to just, creating your own idea of what home looks like, what family is, and just what you represent, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment. I
Yeah.
think it's like really powerful to end on the note of radical imagination and hopefulness and like expansive thinking. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Galen. Thank you, Galen. Thank you, Katie.
welcome.
We're so happy to have you both here, and thank you all. Been such thoughtful questions, amazing audience. And I'm gonna turn off the Zoom, but I would love to take y'all through the gallery and we can like pop in and if you have any questions. Okay, bye.
Bye.